We will need each other. And I do believe that every, victory for the fascist right is also a story of division, sectarianism, failure to make strategic alliances on the anti-fascist left. And we are on the knife edge. We are just on the knife edge. We can't afford to destroy each other.
When we were all locked down and isolating, conspiracy theorists went on the march. The emergence of anti-vaccine scaremongering coupled with virulent anti-Semitism was disconcerting for all of us. But it was even more nuts for Naomi Klein, journalist and author of The Shock Doctrine, who found herself constantly getting mixed up with Naomi Wolf, another author and academic. Klein found herself being drawn into a strange mirror world as she tracked her doppelganger's journey from feminist academic and liberal darling to gun-toting anti-vaxxer, palling around with Steve Bannon. What was it about COVID that strengthened the far right, and how do all of us create doppelgangers of ourselves online? Stay tuned to find out as I talk to Naomi Klein for Downstream. So when did it stop being funny that you were being confused for Naomi Wolf?
I mean, I still find it funny sometimes, to be honest, especially because it still happens. In fact, I was doing a TV interview in the States last week, and the host had to do a retake.
No.
And he didn't realize that he'd done it. And I was like, you have to stop now and redo that because you just called me Naomi Wolf.
Oh my God, you should have kept it in.
I'm not going to name him, but he knows who he is. Yeah. To be honest, it's always been a little cringy. Starting from the very beginning, I start the book with this story about being at Occupy Wall Street and being in a public loo and hearing a couple of demonstrators talking about an article that Naomi Klein had written, and oh my God, she doesn't understand our demands or our movement. And obviously that was lower stakes. I mean, they were talking about an article by Naomi Wolf.
Did you call from inside the store like, sorry, you've got the wrong...
No, I mean, I froze, like flashbacks to high school, Mean Girls, like, oh, what have I written, And then as I listened more, I recognized the article that they were discussing and knew that I had not written it. And so I just very casually came out and made eye contact in the mirror and said, I think you're talking about Naomi Wolf. Words I have had to say many times since then. So that was 2011. But even then, I mean, it was funny, and I would entertain my friends, over drinks with these sorts of stories. They couldn't get enough of it. But I mean, I would also get, I'm going to be talking to Andrew Marr later today, and I'm going to remind him that the last time he interviewed me, it was on the BBC, and he referred to me as Naomi Campbell. So
Naomi Campbell.
I was like, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
You broke so many barriers in fashion.
Exactly.
That
one is harder because then I feel like, the audience is really quite disappointed when I come
How do you
out,
feel about your feud with Tyra Banks?
Yeah, the whole blood diamond thing. Yeah.
You really, I mean, in hindsight, accepting those blood diamonds was really poor form from the author of No Logo.
So there's something about the name Naomi that people do have trouble with. But no, so I mean, even back to Occupy Wall Street, it was the stakes were lower, but it still bothered me just for sort of niche reasons, because that particular context, she had written an article where just, I'm sure you remember from Occupy Wall Street, there was a very, there was a decision not to have a list of demands that politicians could just meet and everyone would go home. It was much, it had a deeper critique of the system than that. And what Wolf had done in the article that they were upset about was claim that she had divined the demands of Occupy Wall Street. She came up with a list based on a random assortment of online communications that she'd had. So even though that was like pretty low stakes, for me, it was quite a cringe because I do try to be pretty careful not to do that sort of thing.
I mean, it was one of the things that really struck me about the book, which is that in one of the early chapters, when you're talking about being mixed up for Naomi Wolf, you sort of really strive to talk about the rigor of your journalistic work and the depth of the research and the scrutiny that you apply to your own writing. Do you feel a bit defensive about this mix-up and that you feel that you've got to put all this distance between the two of you?
Well, I mean, if anything, I think I've put less distance between the two of us. Like I probably cemented the connection forever. I'll never be able to escape it. But I do think that it is important to make a distinction between what investigative journalism does, what rigorous research is, how we make sure that we don't go to press with speculation. Because honestly, I think a lot of people are confused about that. And part of what she does, and she's just a case study of a broader movement, which is this conspiracy culture. And I don't call it conspiracy theory because there really isn't a coherent theory. It's just jumping around. She's more of a conspiracy influencer than she is a theorist. I don't think it's really fair to theory to call her a theorist, because the theories are constantly contradicting each other, right? One minute COVID is a bioweapon cooked up by the Chinese to depopulate the West, and the next minute it's nothing. Don't worry about it. Don't even put on a mask. So like you presumably would have to choose, between the two. But there is something about the fact that there are people who consume these things interchangeably, right? And I, describe this as a doppelganger of journalism because it uses a bunch of the conventions, breaking scoop, like I've got the papers, smoking gun, all of this. But because it's within the attention economy and the need to be first out of the gate to get the clicks, to get the clout, you leap over all the guardrails. So I spent some time in the book just sort of explaining what we try to do, and whether it's investigative journalism or academic research, to check our facts based on the idea that facts still matter. But it isn't so much about me putting distance between her, because it's a doppelganger book. And doppelganger books are, you have to see yourself in the mirror of your doppelganger or you have failed.
Do you ever wonder who the mad woman in the attic is? Like, is it her or is it me?
Absolutely, yes. There's been uncomfortable winces of recognition throughout this journey.
I mean, the moment when Naomi Wolf is on BBC Radio and her book Outrages just gets a tractor driven through it. So it turns out that she made this reading error, and it meant that what was supposed to be a spectacular revelation was exactly wrong. Mm-hmm. I felt such a pang of empathy when that happened, because I thought, oh my God, that could be me one day. And it was this horrible fear of seeing something that you've always had nightmares about happening to someone else, and then you want to put distance between them and you by going, ha, 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 how could you be so stupid? How could this happen to you? I mean, did you ever have those moments of like empathetic recognition with her where you go, oh God, that could have been me?
I mean, it's every writer's worst nightmare. And I mean, it's a little hard for me to just feel straight empathy because a lot of people thought it was me who made that mistake. So like, I only found out that it happened because my feed was filled with people going, thoughts and prayers to Naomi. I was like, oh no, what has she done now? And I'm always having to kind of reverse engineer whatever the scandal is based on people either literally thinking it's me or sort of sending mock sympathy to me. But, I like, as you know, in the book, I have a sort of half jokey equation about not only her, but many figures who many of us have had conversations like, whatever happened to that person? I thought I knew who they were. I thought I could trust them. And now suddenly they're palling around with Tucker Carlson or Elon Musk or, whatever happened to fill in the blanks. And so I have this equation that might not be perfect for every person, but it is narcissism, bracket grandiosity, times social media addiction, which you and I have discussed.
I don't want that mirror being held up to me. I don't want to see the face that's in there.
Plus midlife crisis, which you don't have to worry about for a while.
I got 10 years.
Divided by public shaming. equals right-wing meltdown. So I think that I think that she should have been held accountable for those major errors and outrages. And in general, book publishing, doesn't fact check as much as they should. I always, I'm lucky to be one of the few writers who can afford to pay my own fact checkers, but I pay my fact checkers out of my book advance. I pay my research assistants, and then a whole separate process of going back over every single fact because my first book made me a target, right? I couldn't afford it for my first book. But after that book, I've had the fear of God to not be in that situation where a reporter discovers that you have a huge error in the middle of your book and the whole thing gets discredited. So I think accountability is good, but what happened after that was just a disgusting pile-on online where people were, I think as you say, like putting that distance between them and her, because it's everybody's worst nightmare, and just having a lot of fun shaming her and turning her into a spectacle. And I think that probably nudged her a little bit in the direction and I think she should be held accountable for these terrible decisions she's made to align herself with some of the most dangerous men on the planet. But, I don't think it's great that people, are so cruel to each other online. That's my radical position today.
You're talking about the word accountability. In some ways, it's easier to talk about accountability for Naomi Wolf because she's this individual, and we've seen this descent into fact-free conspiracism. Yeah. But the responsibility for cruelty online is a lot more diffuse.
Yeah.
And we can more easily dodge it.
Yeah. And, the reason why I thought this might be a fun idea for a book, and it got less fun. I have a quote early on in the book from Philip Roth from his really quite wonderful Doppelgänger novel, Operation Shylock, which is about Philip Roth, a character called Philip Roth who has a doppelganger called Philip Roth, creating all kinds of mayhem. And he says it's too ridiculous to take seriously and too serious to be ridiculous. And when I started this, it was more on the ridiculous side of the ledger. And then as things went on and she got closer and closer to Steve Bannon, started engaging in election denial, started taking pictures of herself with her gun, started posting pictures of her new, well, not so new anymore, but her husband is a private detective / mercenary who likes to post pictures of himself doing target practice and so on. So it's gotten more serious than ridiculous just because it is part of a broader fascist surge globally. So, yeah.
So you talked about that seriousness and that kind of quite scary descent into fascism. How can you stop people laughing? When does the comedy stop and the sense of urgency kick in?
Well, this is why I think that sentence is really resonant, because I feel like people have that same feeling about Trump a lot of the time, or at least they did before, where it was just like unclear. And Boris Johnson and Duterte, these sort of buffoonish figures.
Berlusconi, I think, was
absolutely
the original,
Bolsonaro's the only one who's not at all funny.
I know.
Yeah.
He is funny in that he just kept getting COVID. It was like Sideshow Bob stepping on the rakes. Like, it wasn't comedy of his making. It was kind of
exactly.
God's comedy.
Exactly. But he didn't seem to be playing up the character. But yeah, I think, at what point do we stop? I think we're still trying to figure out how to respond to the weight of our historical moment, and frankly, failing most days, right? I think there are flashes, I don't know about you, where I feel like, okay, we're getting close to touching just how consequential the decisions we're making are in these years of, climate breakdown, surging fascism, border violence, just oligarchic concentration of wealth. It's a lot. It's a lot. And so I mean, this, I think the through line of the book and the reason why I thought that doppelganger, doubles, like the book, the through line of the book is less her than it is the way in which we create doubles of ourselves. And our groups, respond to each other in these sorts of mirror world ways. We react to one another rather than behave based on legible principles a lot of the time. And my analysis is that all of it is about not looking at what we need to look at, right? That the third section of the book is called the Shadowlands. And I think that, whether we're staring into our phones, looking at our digital doubles, the way we create these little doppelgangers of ourselves to represent us, which is, why I thought it was interesting that I lost control over my digital identity during COVID. And I thought, well, this is an interesting way in. Or the way we sort of project all that we want to distance ourselves from onto the other, as if we are the ones who are really, married to truth and facts and, facing the weight of our moment, when we all know that we are distracting ourselves endlessly and looking away endlessly. And, there's more than one way to look away. And conspiracy culture plays that role for a lot of people. It's just a decision to divorce from any recognizable shared reality and just make up your own facts, make up your own reality. But,
I mean, one of the things that I was reflecting on as I was reading this book was my own career in the media, because when I started out, I was always paired up against really old white guys. Mm-hmm. And that allowed me to have a sort of brand identity as young, female, brown, left-wing, disruptor. Oh my God, what is she going to do next? Mm-hmm. And then over time, I started getting partnered with young, right-wing women of color.
Oh, interesting.
So it was like they were putting me up against my own Wario. And I then suddenly felt this sense of nausea, where I was like, have I contributed to creating this category of right-wing talking head where they want the
right wing
to play against type? And I've participated in the commodification of identity to the extent that it becomes very powerful for the right. I mean, I felt quite kind of, disoriented by it. And I guess I was wondering, when you're looking at your conspiratorial doppelganger, do you ever feel this little sense of responsibility going, did I make this in some way? Like, it's not just a mirror. Did I create this mirror somehow?
I think it is always worth interrogating, right? And looking at, and sometimes those winces can be really productive because it pushes you to think about what is it that you're doing and what parts of it are most important to you, right? And if it's an easy to doppelgang part of you, then you might want to lean into some of the other part, because you aren't just playing an identity game. That's not the way I perceive your role in the media. You're making arguments and you're representing a set of values and beliefs, and they can doppelgang your identity, but I think it's a lot harder to do that when you're when you're making arguments that are a genuine challenge to power. And so I did interrogate. It wasn't only Wolf who was doing a kind of fact, like, I describe in the book as a kind of fact-free remix of the shock doctrine specifically. And here I'm not saying it was deliberate, but there was a way in which, I mean, I still every tour stop, every time I log on, I hear people who are furious that I wrote the shock doctrine and have failed to recognize that the vaccines are the biggest shock doctrine in world history. Not for the reasons that I believe they are, because there should never have been patents, and this was an opportunity for massive illegitimate enrichment, and we should have, they should have never been patented in the first place, but because they were violating bodily sovereignty, and they believe that there has been a genocide that has been covered up by the quote unquote elites.
There's some graffiti near my house where it says anti-vaxxer, and then next to it, I love my sperm, and then like a big picture of sperm. And I was like,
Yeah, so that's the shock doctrine I missed. The war
Yeah,
on
you're
sperm.
really low on sperm. You really.
But no, but I think I did feel that when I started to hear people using the shock doctrine to sell, what I considered to be, largely made up theories about how public health measures were an attempt by the CCP and Fauci and Gates to bring in Chinese social credit or whatever it was. I mean, the Great Reset, all of that. Like, to be clear, I think there have been real examples of what I would call the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism under cover of COVID. I'm very concerned about them. The NHS has been attacked, under cover of COVID. I live in Canada. The same thing has happened to our public healthcare system. A lot of the attacks on the schools about COVID measures are really just attacks on public schools by the same people who always attack public schools under cover of emergency. But there is this kind of doppelganger of the shock doctrine out there. And I think for a while it made me less willing to talk about that because I couldn't figure out how to talk about the shock doctrine, how to talk about my concerns about Bill Gates, which were not fantastical, but very provable about what he was doing, providing, cover for the drug companies to keep their patents in place and so on, because it was just just a swirl of Bill Gates tracking, implants, and I was just getting like the algorithms were starting to confuse me with Wolf, and I was just like, we're just a mess of Naomi's talking about Bill Gates. So, but I think the worst thing you can do is let that doppelganger experience silence you. I regret not talking more about the patents during this period. I regret any way in which the left has ceded territory to the fake populist right by not going after corporate power and not making the connections with the logics of capitalism, because that's just such a gift to the Steve Bannons of the world who just suck it all up, or Giorgia Meloni, and then twist it and turn it into transphobia and xenophobia and, an incredibly malevolent agenda.
I mean, is there a way to sort of reclaim the integrity of left-wing ideas without it being about insisting on your intellectual property rights? Because the strength of the left has always come from the dissemination of ideas in a very open way. The Communist Manifesto was meant to be passed hand to hand from worker to worker. Yeah. And then, in some ways, shock doctrine being appropriated by conspiracy theorists is testament to its success and its meaning and its power as an idea. So how do you navigate that as someone who's on the left?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree. I think the left should be taking popular education as seriously as it originally was, with the original pamphleteers and the idea of doing this kind of popular education, in part because the alternative was conspiracy theory, right? I mean, I have a section in the book that looks at anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools, and in part, looks at the history of Marxist thought as in part being a history of a whole bunch of Jews banging their head against the brick wall of history, saying it's not the Jews that are the result of your pain or causing your pain, but it's actually this system. So I don't think any of us should embrace our ideas being distorted and turned into like a warped mirror of themselves.
But is there a way to do that without going, it's mine, like this is my idea?
I don't think it's about intellectual property. I think it's about having a robust left that is doing system analysis. And I think that when that doesn't happen, conspiracy culture swirls because the center isn't holding, because there's so much suffering, and because all of the promises that capitalism has made about the meritocracy, and if you work hard, you're going to succeed and you'll be able to climb this ladder, it's falling apart. And people know that. And our education system doesn't explain what capitalism is. It says it's all about sunshine and Big Macs and freedom and, getting the rewards that you deserve. And so when the system fails, people are really, really vulnerable to somebody pulling them aside and going, it's actually the Jews, or it's actually it's the CCP, or it's this meeting once a year, right? And so the need for that robust system analysis is urgent, because I think it's the only force that can drain power from this surging authoritarianism. If they were just taking the ideas and putting them to good use, then
you'd be like, fine.
Yes, always. It doesn't matter if you get credit or not. You want them to disseminate. The problem is this. I listened to hundreds of hours of Steve Bannon to write this book, unfortunately, and the most chilling moments were when I would hear him sounding like what the left used to sound like and doesn't really sound like anymore, because there is not as much of a anti-corporate left as there used to be, let alone an anti-capitalist left. It's much more partisan and reactive.
It is part of the appeal of the likes of Steve Bannon and the very reactionary authoritarian right, is that they're saying, here's how to live, and it will make you a better person, a stronger person, a smarter person, a more worthy person. Whereas the left, we've retreated a lot into you do what you want to do, except there is no you do what you want to do, because if you are perceived in the wrong way, particularly online, people jump down your throat.
Yeah. Well, Bannon is different than some of the other people who are more like, this is how to live. He's less of a lifestyle guy. He's not Jordan Peterson or,
I don't think anyone goes, how do I get the Steve Bannon look?
Exactly. No, he's more of an organizer. I mean, he is the guy who is organizing, the takeover of your local Republican Party, your local school board, get those books banned. He's very deliberately building a political coalition that he calls MAGA Plus, which is, the plus is women who they haven't been able to really lock down enough to win the last couple of elections. And so in the same way that he peeled away some Democratic voting working class guys who were pissed off about having voted for Democrats 3-4 times, who promised that they were going to renegotiate trade deals, and then voted for Trump because he said he was going to do it. Now, it wasn't the only reason why people voted for Trump, but it doesn't need to be that many people who you peel away with these messages. He now sees that opportunity with who he calls the warrior moms. So it's interesting, because I definitely think that there is an appeal around, I'm going to help you learn how to live, that certain people are offering on the right. But I think with Bannon, what he's offering is a political program. He's offering a plan. It's an activist space. His slogan is action, action, action. And he refers to his listeners as the War Room Posse, and he makes them feel like they're not just listening or watching, they are part of his army.
But it's that thing, which is, I want David from accounts to feel like Ajax the conqueror.
Yeah.
And maybe it is difficult to draw the line between political organizing, LARPing, and, entertainment. Andrew Tate, there's a Andrew Tate group chat called The War Room, which is, again, very similar, trying to say, we're going to build you up and empower you if you just do these things.
Yeah. And I think that this is where the left is at something of a disadvantage, because it takes more time and it's more complicated to build the kind of mass power that has any kind of chance of standing up to the sort of consolidated wealth that we're talking about. Whereas Bannon is perfectly happy to just have a plan to get back into the White House. And so there is a plan, and it is, take over politics at every level, peel off part of your opposition by using all of this COVID residual anger and pivoting it in the way that we've been talking about. So what is the left plan? We can diagnose, we can do systems analysis, but that's just going to make people feel helpless for the most part, because then they're going to better understand that as an individual, there's nothing that they can do. They can only stand up to these systems in mass collective action, right? If there is a conspiracy and there's just, 5 guys who are responsible for all of the suffering in the world, then, like the bumper sticker says, make the Nuremberg Code great again. Let's bring them up on war crimes trials, right? I mean, that's part of their plan, is a sort of a fantasy of justice, right? That's also at the heart of QAnon, is like there's going to be a great storm and all of the bad people are going to get arrested and they're going to be brought up on charges and there will be justice because we will replace them with the good people.
Well, the observation that January 6th was people dressing up and storming the Capitol. It was like, a sort of Comic-Con element of it as well. Like you get to live this fantasy for a day, except it's real.
Yeah. And, this is the Bannon playbook. He wants people to inhabit their avatars. And so many of these figures are very, very skilled from the world of entertainment and reality television, right? So Bannon's worked in Hollywood. He's worked in video games. Trump, obviously, reality television. Tate as well, former reality show star. The only one who doesn't really have this history is Peterson. Joe Rogan, also former reality show.
Didn't he voice Kermit the Frog?
What?
Didn't he voice Kermit the Frog?
I don't know. I mean, he's the only one who's just a natural at this, I guess. I always feel as a Canadian, I need to apologize when I'm abroad.
If I had to start apologizing for every Brit out there, we'd be here all day.
Yeah, but so the left proposition is not just we're out here making a better argument about what is really driving mass misery. We also have to connect that analysis with a credible organizing strategy that shatters the sense that there's nothing you can do about these huge systems, because it's a hell of a lot easier to take on a cabal than it is to take on a system, right? And that's why, if anything has made me feel a little bit optimistic in recent days, it's been the UAW going out on strike, the United Auto Workers in the States, and the fact that there's a great new leader of that union, Sean Fain, who was an insurgent candidate, and he's on the news because he's taken on the big three automakers and he's doing real left populism. And he is saying, these companies have recorded record profits and they've given themselves massive wages and our workers haven't been able to keep up with the cost of living increases and we're going to get them. And that just having somebody out there who has a clear left analysis and a plan about what to do about it. We are going to disrupt your assembly lines. I feel like it makes the Bannons of the world sort of shrivel up and die, because they are not die, but they can only sell the counterfeit if the real thing isn't on offer or even in the public sphere. So when words and action momentarily are married, in these moments of mass worker action, or the debt collective, or tenant organizing, or any of the ways that people are finding collective power, that's going to do more to drain the power of right-wing conspiracy culture than an army of fact checkers and content moderators.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about one of the advantages that the right has, which is they've got this screen-based ecosystem, whether it's YouTube or accounts on Twitter, where they're bringing together a community and making it lonelier all the time. So I was reminded of that bit where Anthony says of Cleopatra, she makes hungry where most she satisfies. So it's satisfying this need for social connection, but because it's not the real thing, you're getting hungrier and hungrier all the time. How does the left draw a balance between contesting these spaces in a legacy media or social media ecology, but also just being in, flesh space, where we can touch each other and make eye contact and engage with each other as human beings and not digital avatars?
Yeah, I mean, that quote is so interesting because I feel like, back to my first book, No Logo, which I wrote before the explosion of personal branding and some of the things that I revisit here. A lot of what I did in that book was track the way in which the first mega lifestyle brands like Nike and Apple and Starbucks were co-opting revolutionary rhetoric, putting Martin Luther King on Apple ads, and yes, this is before your time, but it was it was weird, and there was all of this unease, like all of the iconography of the 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War movement was suddenly a Nike ad, and Gandhi was from the grave shilling for Apple, and And on the one hand, you can say, oh, nothing means anything anymore. But that wasn't my feeling. My feeling was like in the 90s, where we had been told that nobody liked left ideas. I thought it was really exciting that these companies, with all of their market research, had found that what people actually wanted was revolution. And obviously, they weren't going to get it from their running shoes or their laptops. So there would be that constant hunger cycle that you're using much more literary references for. So for capitalism, that's great, because you'll just have to keep shopping. You'll get like a little hit, and then you'll crash again, and you'll have to shop again in order to get that feeling.
I hate myself for the way in which I instinctively scroll through clothing when I feel sad, and it makes me feel worse. And I'm like, why am I doing this? It's just like my classic depression activity.
Yeah, exactly.
Horrible.
Well, and it's helpful to just be aware that you're doing it because you're sad, or you're doing it because you're insecure, and people shop. One of the times when you have the highest spike in consumption is when people are becoming parents for the first time, because they're panicked and they don't have people who will help them figure out how to be parents anymore, because if we don't live in communities, we tend to be isolated. And so you just think, if I were to just get this $1,000 bouncy chair, everything would be fine, But I remember that from when I never have I been more of a consumer drone than
was it a fear
that
bypassed your own critical awareness of the thing you were doing? It was just...
Well, it was really useful to me to see that statistic, like that this is the time when consumption is higher than at any point in our lives. And not just because you need a whole bunch of new things. It's because it's well beyond what you need. And it's just fear. Yeah, it's just fear. I know it keeps it in check a little bit. It doesn't keep it completely in check, obviously. But it's still helpful to know. Mm-hmm.
You were talking about the symbols of revolution and the language of revolution being co-opted by
let's come back to that.
90s capitalism. Yeah. I didn't know that Nike had used Martin Luther King, but
Apple used Martin Luther King.
Apple.
Nike used a whole bunch of Vietnam War anthems.
Oh my God. Because then the thing that it made me think of was, in this very direct way, Nike revealing that it partnered with Colin Kaepernick all that time when he was being blacklisted by the NFL. Because I remember the conversations going on at that time, which for lots of people on the anti-racist left, for lots of Black people, was a feeling of like, well, at least someone's standing with us during this time. But there was also this queasiness of going, but you're doing it to sell your shoes. I mean, how did you make sense of moments like that?
Yeah, I mean, I was teaching a course at the time, so it was helpful. I was teaching a course called The Corporate Self, an undergraduate course. So we were sort of processing all of the Nike ads in real time. I mean, it's interesting because it's not unlike the people's reaction to the Barbie movie, right? I don't know, have you? Where it's like, oh, wow, all these feminist critiques are in here and they keep talking about patriarchy. But like ultimately,
I really fucking hated the self-consciously woke dialogue. Like there's this one moment where the teenage girl's like, white savior Barbie, and I was like, it's like they took Tumblr from 2015 and shook it upside down all over the script. Like it was just so focus grouped and calculated
to get everybody.
Turned me off. It really turned me off.
Yeah. And ultimately, like, just to be a boring, lefty, eco-feminist, it is an advertisement. It's an extraordinarily historically good advertisement for a plastic doll. And even if you loved the movie, maybe especially because if you loved the movie, you should know that will lead to materially this selling of many, many, many more plastic dolls. And so its success is a huge failure for the earth. But at any rate, we were talking about them doing their market research for us and the co-optation. Well, so yeah, I think you can get really down about the ways that these ideas are being co-opted by the right, or you can be like, wow, these really are popular ideas. We should be making more of them. And that one of the things that's been, I think, nice for me about the last few weeks of touring, I've been in the US touring with the book, and just got here to the UK. There haven't been that many we're not post-pandemic, but since since the beginning of the pandemic, there haven't been that many spaces for people to gather as leftists collectively. And, one of the things that's been helpful to name is the particular experience that a lot of us had of going from the highs of the Bernie Sanders campaign to lockdown, Biden, Democratic Party rallying, and just that the combination of that extreme political disappointment and being isolated from each other, so not being able to process it, re-strategize, think about what we want to do next. And instead, in that isolation and in our disappointment, a lot of what we did was just attack each other. And sort of, I write in the book, we went from this, this surfing this wave of not me, us, and this kind of real joy of kind of a release from individualism and ego. I mean, that was what was so powerful about being on the road with Bernie was, the slogan, not me, us, originally, I think a lot of people just thought it was Bernie saying, this is not about me, this is about us. But when you were out on the campaign, it took on this whole other life and meaning, which was much more about, what Astrid Taylor talks about with the debt collective, where with something like medical debt or student debt, it's this private shame that people are carrying, and it's just all me in the sense of my fault and my burden. But when you meet lots of other people who have that same burden, you find an us, and that us has power. Like you organize into a debtors union, then you're a problem for the creditors. And and in the same way that when workers organize, they're a problem for their bosses. So to go from those highs, of being in Las Vegas when Bernie won the Strip, which was like, it was the happiest moment of my political life, just because it's Vegas, right? And it's shiny and gold and Trumpy.
I mean, was it one of those moments of politics where you feel like the boundaries of the self dissolve a bit, and it's like,
well, it just absolutely, yes, because you've got the nurses and you've got teachers, and you have just so many different movements coming together and just reaching towards each other, and then the coinciding of lockdown, I so vividly remember being on my couch. I was still living in the States at the time, and watching the whole Democratic Party just coalesce around Biden, and then almost instantly, the Bernie movement just fractured, and everybody starting their own podcasts and attacking each other. And
hey, not too much about podcasts.
Listen, I
got a cat to feed, all right?
But it was, we went from not me, us to just being dropped in this ocean of me, 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 me. And that's all we knew how to do. And it was just heartbreaking.
Well, I really want to talk about this, because I think it's something where I feel, again, really personally conflicted about my own work, because Novara came out of the student movement. We all met through occupying our university, which was UCL, or, the plate glass windows of Millbank, which was the Tory Party HQ, being smashed.
I remember that. That was cool.
That was my first year of university. Oh, wow. And I just remember it's me and my friend who were like in Millbank, and she looks like me. She's like my doppelganger, but blonde and Irish. Like we're just like same height, same face, but like two different colorways. Like that was how we all met, and that was where the organization came from. And we've always felt like we're part of a movement, but journalism is different from being a propagandist for the movement. And there are all kinds of tensions that come with it. And I think that I often balk at the constraints of what I feel are unfair expectations from parasocial relationships, where I'm like, why is someone on Twitter yelling at me like they know me or like they own me? But the fact is that it's not unreasonable to have political expectations or editorial expectations of someone whose public career is the result of coming from this movement. So I was wondering, like, how do you navigate that? The sort of, the rigors and the demands of journalism, that you've got to go where the facts are leading you. The fact you've got political aims, the fact that you want to think critically and independently, but you also want to be accountable to people. How do you square all of these circles?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot going on there. I think left media should not be propaganda. And we, I like coming back to what we were talking about earlier about facts do matter, research does matter. It's part of the reason why I always hated the idea that you are supposed to be a brand, because what I know about being a brand is that you repeat yourself endlessly. If you're a good brand, you've identified your core meaning, and you're just repeating and reinforcing, and you have message discipline, which is pretty much the opposite of being a good journalist, a good investigator, which requires that you follow your research wherever it leads. You have to be able to be changed by what you're learning. And so I think these projects are really antithetical. That doesn't mean that you don't have like an image in the world, but branding is a very particular thing. Branding is chasing your own tail ad infinitum. And that might be okay to sell running shoes, but it really is not a good model for being a public intellectual or a journalist. And I think we should push back on it. And I think also part of the cruelty that we've been talking about online is that there's a cost to performing a thing version of yourself, which is what it means to be a brand. You're out there saying, this is thing me, this is commodity version of me. People will believe you, and they will think that they can throw very hard things at you, and that you won't bleed, because things don't bleed. And so I think there's just I don't think we quite believe each other are real online.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a problem. It's not the only reason why people are cruel. They're also racist. They're also misogynist. But I think there is also this factor that is driving it. So we should try to de-thing ourselves if we can.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate on the difference between a journalist and a propagandist.
Yeah.
I was talking about this with my partner, and one of the things that he was saying is, well, doesn't this keep you locked into very bourgeois norms? So if you say, well, this is what a journalist does, and there are certain things that a journalist does which cannot be subordinated to your political aims, doesn't that make you a worse communist? Doesn't this make you a worse socialist? Doesn't this make you worse at bringing the world you want to see into existence?
I think you need to be transparent about what values you're holding yourself to, what standards you're holding yourself to. I've never, and I don't think you do, subscribe to the idea that you're objective, that you don't have politics. No, you wear your politics on your sleeve. You're in it because you want to change the world. But you're still accountable for what you say, and you're still going to hold yourself to standards of accuracy and truth and probing. And why? Why does that matter? You also have to say why that matters and why it makes for stronger movements, and why movements always have, strong movements always have powerful art, powerful journalism, like it's an ecosystem, and this is a piece of the ecosystem. I think where we get into trouble is when the rest of the ecosystem is not healthy, right? So, the way I'm interested in the history of what Novara came out of the movements Novara came out of. I probably became aware of you around the Corbyn movement, and saw you as a kind of the media arm of the Corbyn project. Maybe that's wrong, but that's the way I saw you. Not that you were propagandists. I know it's always a little tinge, but you also have to be able to do critique, because if movements can't do critique, and that, it's going to be through the media, that's how we're going to hear each other, then you're just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. But, I get what I'm describing around the Bernie moment with all of those podcasts were relatively healthy when there was a political project that was healthy. It was when the political project collapsed that it just seemed like the left was a bunch of podcasts. And I don't think that is a left. And I think that if people are, they're always going to be cruel online. But I think these parasocial relationships take on an overinflated and unhealthy role when they're subbing in for collective organizing that isn't in a healthy state, and is that happening here?
Well, I mean, I think that it's, since the demise of the Corbyn movement, and again, it was straight from Corbyn into lockdown, and that was a grim 6 months. Mm-hmm. It was really like a bereavement, because not only was this, central force of your life gone, you're also being piled on with humiliation by everyone crowing and saying they were right about you all along.
Right.
And then you were separate from your comrades because you couldn't see each other, and you could only communicate online. Like, it was a very grim time. And I think that kind of just anecdotally, there are lots of people trying different things, and there's kind of like embryonic experimentation going on. But certainly I think with Novara, it is this ongoing discussion about what does it mean to be a socialist media outlet, which takes journalistic standards very seriously and takes socialism very seriously. And there are conflicts there. There are tensions there. It's not
But the more
resolvable.
robust the socialist project is outside of Novara, I think the clearer your role is going to be. It's just, it's when it isn't clear that there
Pravda,
is...
you know?
You said it, not me.
I mean, I kind of want to talk a little bit about, this thing of turning oneself into a brand, because, we all do it, right? We all do it. Now that social media exists, anyone who has Instagram or TikTok or Twitter is doing brand them to some extent. What does it mean for the left to be contesting so much of its politics through these digital avatars? I mean, one is that it stops people seeing each other as human beings, but what does it do to the politics?
Yeah. I don't think it's been great. I mean, in general.
Understatement of the century.
And I do want to say that these political campaigns that we've both referenced, I think that we should strive for more in terms of, I think we should expect from these political campaigns that when there are losses, they're not just abruptly end, and there not be a process for trying to hold on to all of that organizing energy and to think strategically about what the next stage was. I mean, I was a Bernie surrogate, and I think there was like one email that we all got that was just like,
you guys got an email?
I mean, I love the guy. I'm not blaming him, but social relations have never been his strength. But I think if we are going to ask people to go all in for these campaigns and these moments when we sense some opening, they're not all going to win. Most of them are going to fail, and there should be a strategy for holding that space so that we don't all turn on each other afterwards. But the branding piece of it, and this is, a big part of the reason why I wanted to come back to these themes, and it's something that I talk about with a lot of my comrades in the movement, about the way the logic of personal branding and even collective branding, because it isn't just the individual brands, it's also the movement as brand that I think is part of why we've had these like peaks and big valleys where it seems like everybody is talking about whatever the thing is. And we have, historic numbers of people on the streets, whether we're talking about climate strikes, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, it just seems like everybody is with the program. And then the crash, and then the internal divisions. And part of it, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who I quote in the book a fair bit and is a wonderful colleague and friend. She's written a fair bit about why movements need more democracy, so that it isn't just, I think it's important that we have ways of talking about this that deep personalize it. I think people are trying to build movements with really inadequate tools. And so we're on these corporate platforms, and people get, lifted up to leadership positions, because they're persuasive, because they're great at messaging, there's whatever it is. Sometimes it's a little bit random, but they aren't elected, and there aren't mechanisms in place to hold them accountable. So, in the book I talk about how that, that happened to me with No Logo. Like, there was a move that book predicted that there was going to be a large anti-corporate uprising. There wasn't yet. There were just like, you were talking about these sort of embryonic, like little things. There was like Reclaim the Streets, and there was like an anti-sweatshop movement, but there wasn't a big movement. And then when that book was at the press, these huge protests started popping off all over the place in Seattle and then Genoa and so on. And because I had written a book, I suddenly was, according to the media, the face of this movement. And it was bullshit, because I had just written a book. Nobody elected me. Nobody could hold me accountable. And suddenly, because this is what corporate media wants, they want like 2 or 3 people who are going to be the face of this thing. And, I suddenly was like, No Logo was a brand, and the whole thing got completely out of my control.
So Vogue asked you to do shopping with the enemy.
Yes, I didn't do it, but they asked me. There were all kinds of like, there was advertising. I got offers to do designer ad campaigns to do, and people did go create No Logo products. I think there's still a No Logo craft beer. People send me pictures of it. I don't know if it's any good, but I wanted to write about this from the inside and not have it be like a call out, like, oh, that person, wasn't accountable. I really just think we need to have democratic movements, and in the absence of democratic movements, people are still trying to build movements, and it's not working. These tools are failing us. So we should try some new ones. And I think we are trying new ones. This is part of why we're seeing a wave of union organizing.
I mean, isn't it also about shifting the kinds of political relationships we have with one another? Because if all of us are brands are always competing, and they're always competing for attention, and they're competing for money.
Yep.
And if we turn ourselves into things and we're having relationships as things, you can't build a movement based on solidarity with that. But the relationship between comrades, which is a word that you just used, is so different, and it's so rich and layered.
And you want, as you were saying before, you want your ideas to spread, whereas the logic of capitalism and branding is I want the credit, this is mine. It's an ownership model, which is exactly the opposite of what you want. If you want to change the world.
This is my most cancelable opinion.
Oh dear.
This is my most cancelable opinion.
You're going to get me canceled.
Okay. You're going to get cancelled by proxy. I'm so sorry.
Right.
It's time somebody brought down Naomi Klein, and it's going to be this podcast. My most cancelable opinion is that the anti-racist movement has become so concerned with intellectual property, whether that's, having beef with POC because, that lumps us all in together, or whether that's saying, okay, well, if we use this slogan, you can't use this slogan, and how different that was to the ethos of the Black Panther movement. Black Panther movement is like, you want to call yourself the Yellow Panthers? Amazing. Like, you want to call yourself the White Panthers? Amazing. Whereas we're so concerned with drawing these lines of separation in between. It's fundamentally liberal. It's liberal in the sense that liberalism perceives other people always as a threat and an incursion, rather than what are the generative, creative relationships that occur between people.
And obviously it comes from real injustices, right? I mean, it comes from real examples of intellectual theft, of Black women not being credited for intellectual contributions to movements for many, many decades. So I don't think it's just liberalism. I think it's also a needed corrective. It has been a needed corrective. And I think it is also a needed corrective to talk about how we want ideas to spread.
But I think even this idea of credit is a tricky one, because credit matters when you have a commodity and it's either about your place within an attention economy or a literal economy where people make money from doing these things. And of course, the appropriation of this stuff is wrong and it's bad. But to simply receive credit is not the same as what is the basis of a movement which can really build. And I'm not just talking about Black Lives Matter. I've also very much seen it with the relentless focus on cultural appropriation from South Asian radicals in this country. And I go, yes, I get it. I do get it. But okay, everyone recognizes that henna comes from us. What next? Like, why is recognition the thing we're striving for?
Well, I think it comes down to people just trying to make a really screwed up system work for them, right? I mean, and I think that if there is a genuine revolutionary project that has any prospect of transforming this system to a more egalitarian one, there might be more openness to challenging these ideas around, intellectual credit and so on. But within capitalism, someone's going to make money off of it. Somebody's going to get the credit. Somebody is going to be on the cover of the magazine. And I think a lot of people feel like if they're not fighting for it to be them, it's going to be somebody else. And they're right. They're absolutely right. So I guess it all comes down to building that revolutionary project, because without it, I think we're just going to be fighting for our scraps.
I know this is a really big gear shift, but so Jewishness is really central to this book. It's one of the threads which connects you and the other Naomi. It's central to the anti-Semitic conspiracism of, the globalists are doing this, that, and the other. But then you also talk about this doubleness of being both victim and perpetrator within the context of Israel. So I guess, can you talk me through how doubleness and the motif of the doppelganger brought you into this sort of analysis of Jewishness, Zionism, and Israel?
Yeah. Well, I think I came across a paper by Carolyn Rooney, who's here in the UK, who talked about Israel as a country with doppelganger politics, by which she meant that it was a nation that had like a fundamental split where the Israeli Jews projected everything that they could not bear about themselves onto the Palestinian other. And then there's also like this sort of doppelganger at the heart of the Zionist project, which is that of the new Jew versus the old Jew. So this is something, I quote Philip Roth, as I mentioned, in with all apologies to my 20-year-old self, who hurled a Philip Roth book across my dorm room and vowed never, ever to read another book by Philip Roth.
We all say things in haste.
But I was reading so much doppelganger literature, and I just kept seeing references to Operation Shylock, his 1993 doppelganger masterpiece, and I ended up finding it to be really, really useful because in part because of that ridiculous seriousness thread, but also the ways in which it really engages with this sort of the unshakable ethnic double, right? Which is the double that is projected onto people who are not white and Christian around the world, which is the double that isn't the brand that you create, that you think you have in the world. It's the one that other people create and project onto you. So for Roth, it's Shylock, who is the doppelganger of all Jews projected onto them. But then it becomes a book about Zionism, limited in its critique, but still interesting. And he's very fascinated with the figure of the new Jew as a doppelganger of the old Jew, of the diasporic Jew.
So what's the new Jew and the old Jew?
So this is the project of Zionism, is to create a new Jew who is the muscle-bound, gun-toting, strong Jew.
Knows Krav Maga.
I mean, I think that the critique from somebody like Roth, who is like it's a kind of an anti-literary, you with your books who couldn't save yourselves from the Holocaust. We new Jews will protect you, and so it's this. There's that doppelganger in Israeli culture, old Jew, new Jew. And there's a way that it blames the victims of the Holocaust for the Holocaust, some mostly unspoken, sometimes spoken. And then this is what Rooney was writing about, the way Israel's settler colonialism becomes a doppelganger of the ways Jews were treated in Europe. She's not talking about the Nazis, and neither am I, but she is talking about the pogroms, the ghettoization, all the enclosures, the second-class citizenship, the apartheid system that is in Israel. This has been some of the more controversial parts of the book. It's a little bit of a twist for people who thought that the book was just going to be about, feeling superior to Naomi Wolf and Steve Bannon. And suddenly we're in Gaza. Like, wow. Yeah.
So what happened when you were in Gaza?
That's a story. So that's what happened. I mean, so I was in Gaza. The shock doctrine had come out, and my previous books had been published in Hebrew, and I'd been approached by some Israeli publishers to publish the shock doctrine. The shock doctrine has a chapter on Israel and its role in what I call the disaster capitalism complex. And it looks at the export of all of these Israeli spy and surveillance and military tools. So I wanted the book to come out in Hebrew, but I also had written in support of BDS and was in contact with the BDS committee. And so we tried to figure out a way for Shock Doctrine to come out in Hebrew and Arabic at the same time with an activist publisher called Andalus that doesn't exist anymore, that up to that point had only published Arabic writing and translation. So I launched the book on the West Bank. We did a lot of things to as much as possible have a book come out in Hebrew that did not support the Israeli state. It's complicated because most arts organizations get money and so on. But anyway, we did our best. It was blessed by the BDS committee. But before I went on the book tour, I wanted to go to Gaza to do some reporting. So there's a scene in the book about coming back from Gaza through the Erez checkpoint. We had no trouble getting into Gaza because at that point they didn't know who I was at the checkpoint going in. But coming back, because I had done a press conference in Gaza and talked about BDS and talked about, there had just been a huge assault on Gaza a few months earlier. When we came back through the checkpoint, they were waiting for us. And there was this really bizarre experience that we had where first they kept us waiting for about 3 hours. It's very strange because there's no way to communicate. There's just the wall. You're on the other side of the wall, and there's surveillance cameras everywhere. They see us. We're the only ones there, and they won't open the gate to let us through. But if you are there past a curfew, then you can't get through, and you're in this sort of weird zone where there's nothing there. So finally, the door opens. We get through. We go through the security check, and then they take my husband, Avi, and say, and there's a guy who introduces himself as Erez from Erez. So
you've got another doppelganger.
Another doppelganger. They just follow me everywhere. So Erez from Erez takes Avi upstairs, and he meets a general in his corner office, and he gets this huge speech where they tell him that look out the window, and there's a bunch of tanks doing a security exercise. And they say, do you know how close we were to sending in ground troops to Gaza? Which at that point, there had never been ground troops sent into Gaza since the blockade. And we were going to send them in to rescue you. You have no idea how much danger you were in. We were in no danger. We were hosted by Palestine, we were invited. And they said, we see everything, we hear everything, and we were going to re-invade Gaza to rescue you and get your woman under control. Literally, they said that to Avi, about me, we know what she's been saying. And we don't care what you say because you're Jewish and we will rescue you. So they were saying, you have a doppelganger. Just as the rest of the world only sees you as Shylock, we only see you as Jews. We don't care about your politics or what you say. We will rescue you from the Palestinian enemy, even though you think that they're your friends. It was just the biggest mindfuck you could possibly imagine.
And it's also deeply manipulative. It's there'll be a ground invasion of Gaza.
For
you know, because of you and your supposed solidarity with these people, we're going to invade them even more than we ordinarily do.
Yeah. I never told that story. I wrote about what we saw in Gaza and reported on the aftermath of that invasion. There have been so many since. But I never told the story of that particular gaslighting mission that they did for Erez from Erez. But to me, it's so, I shared the story in the book, and thanks for asking. Nobody's asked about it.
It's because we've got I call it Zionism derangement syndrome in the UK, where if you try and make any arguments critical of Zionism, it gets pulled into Corbyn, anti-Semitism, the left, and it's just...
Well, there's something about the offer that they were saying, that is really it's not just Israel that's making that offer. I think the UK is making that offer with its militarized borders. It's take the guns, take the walls, take the prisons. We will keep you safe from the hordes. And, when I look at my doppelganger, she seems to have thrown in with that ideology. She's got the guns, and she's, talking about the wars on the border. And, I think as the climate crisis accelerates and the wars never end and poverty deepens, this is going to be the offer to all of us. And we have to decide if we want to take the offer.
I've got one last question, which is when so many different aspects of your identity are attached to fucked up things. And in your case, it was, your Jewishness being invoked by this general to commit an appalling act of violence. But, in my case, it might be my womanhood being invoked to stomp on trans people, or being a Westerner and what that means for all of the, extractive, exploitative activities of, Western corporations and the things which fuel my own consumption.
Yeah.
When we're so tied to all of these things, is it possible to have a stable identity? And is it even desirable to have one?
I think we are in a moment that we simply cannot bear as individuals. It's just too hard. I mean, we are in this simultaneous unearthing, unveiling of just, unbearable networks of suffering that sustain the lives of the privileged outside of the Shadowlands. And I think COVID acted as a unearthing and as a revealer of all the people who hold up our world and allowed those of us who were able to be locked down and bore all of the risk. And I think that generated a certain kind of derangement that is part of what I'm tracking in the book, of a lot of privileged people claiming that they were victims of genocide and apartheid and Jim Crow and slavery, and all the crimes of the last 500 years were projected onto a vaccine app or, being made to wear masks. But I don't think any of us are really able to look at the unbearability of our complicity in these past, future, and present networks of suffering, extinction, dispossession. We can only bear it together. We can only bear it in the sturdiest, widest possible coalitions. Like I quote Ariel Angel, the editor of Jewish Currents, at the end of the book, saying, we're going to need each other. And part of recognizing that we will need each other in the face of surging fascism and climate breakdown means that we are going to have to get over ourselves a little bit, whether it's our individual brands or our individual identity groups, which does not mean erasure, which does not mean annihilate the ego or dissolve into some mush of no difference that pretends that we are all coming into coalition with the same risks, debts, and needs. No, but we will need each other. And I do believe that every, victory for the fascist right is also a story of division, sectarianism, failure to make strategic alliances on the anti-fascist left. And we are on the knife edge. We are just on the knife edge. We can't afford to destroy each other.
Just a little sprinkle of ego death, just a tiny, a little Salt Bay sprinkle.
Yeah, find your doppelganger and just get humble if you can.
Yeah, snog your doppelganger if you can. Naomi Klein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ash. This was really, really deep. Thanks.
Well, have fun at the BBC.
Oh my God. This is a good way to start. I'm Naomi Klein, and I am at Novara Media right now, having just done a wonderful in-depth interview. And this is why I love Novara Media. And I listen regularly and watch to find out what the hell is going on in the UK. It is so critical to have independent media that we can trust, that goes deep on the issues and also lets people stay up on the day-to-day twists and turns. It's going to be especially important for your next election. So I'm incredibly grateful that Novara Media exists, and it exists because people support it. So make sure to support Novara Media. We need left institutions, and that means that we have to support them when they're doing such great work as Novara Media is. Thanks.